The sun over the Missouri Ozarks does not just shine, it weighs on you. It is a physical presence, a heavy, humid blanket that settles over the rolling hills and the creek beds until the very air feels like it has been boiled in a kettle. By late July, the fescue in the pastures usually turns the color of a discarded cigar, brittle and sharp enough to draw blood from a cattle's shin. Most men in these parts deal with the heat by retreating. They retreat into the hum of an air conditioner that struggles against the rising mercury, or they retreat into the shade of a porch with a glass of lukewarm tea, watching the horizon for a rain cloud that never seems to come. But Marcus Henderson was not most men. On a Tuesday morning, when the thermometer on the side of the general store already read 92 degrees at 9 a.m., Marcus was not in the shade. He was 30 feet in the air, standing on the pitch of his farmhouse roof, hauling buckets of rich, dark earth up a ladder. To the folks driving by on the county road, it looked like a man had finally let the isolation of the high ridges get the better of his mind. Silas Thorne pulled his rusted Ford to a stop at the edge of Marcus's fence line, leaning an elbow out the window. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and squinted up at the roof. "Marcus," he hollered, his voice rasping through the heat. "I've seen men plant gardens in the ground, and I've seen men plant gardens in raised beds. But I'll be damned if I ever saw a man try to grow a hayfield on top of his shingles. You planning on grazing your cows up there next?" Marcus didn't stop his work. He emptied a bucket of soil into a cedar frame he had bolted to the roof joists. He wiped sweat from his eyes with a grime-streaked forearm and looked down at Silas. "It isn't for the cows, Silas, it's for the house. The earth remembers how to stay cool, tin and asphalt, they just remember how to burn." Silas chuckled, a dry sound like gravel shifting. "You're going to rot your rafters out, Marcus. That much weight and that much moisture, you'll be eating dinner in the kitchen and the whole ceiling will come down on your head. You're building a tomb, not a house. Mark my words, when the first heavy rain hits, that grass is going to turn into a mudslide and bury your porch." Marcus just nodded and went back to his buckets. He had heard it all before. The neighbors called it Henderson's Folly. They called it the hillbilly hanging garden. They laughed at the sight of a grown man spending his life savings on waterproof membranes and specialized drainage gravel instead of a new tractor or a modern HVAC system. They saw a man who was obsessed with an idea that defied the common sense of the valley. In a world of modern steel and high-efficiency insulation, Marcus Henderson was looking backward to a time when the earth itself was the only shield a man had against the elements. The logic of the valley was simple. If it's hot, you turn up the fan. If it's cold, you burn more wood. You don't invite the wild things to live on your roof. You don't turn your home into a living, breathing organism that requires a mower instead of a repairman. But Marcus saw something they didn't. He saw the way the heat moved. He saw the way the sun hammered against a traditional roof, turning the attic into a furnace that radiated heat downward long after the sun had set. He saw the energy bills that bled his neighbors dry every August. He could have followed the path of least resistance. He could have bought the thickest fiberglass bats the hardware store sold. He could have sprayed foam into every crevice until the house was sealed like a plastic bag. But he didn't. He knew that sealing a house wasn't the same as making it breathe. He knew that the old ways, the ways of the sod houses on the Great Plains, held a secret that the modern world had forgotten in its rush toward convenience. The motivation for this madness went back 20 years, to a summer that stayed burned into Marcus's memory like a brand. His father, a man of iron will and calloused hands, had lost the original family farm during the drought of the late 90s. It wasn't just the lack of rain that broke them, it was the cost of survival. Marcus remembered sitting in the kitchen of that old farmhouse, the air so thick and hot it felt like breathing soup. His father had spent every dime they had trying to keep the livestock alive and the house habitable for Marcus's ailing mother. They had run the old window units until the wiring groaned, but the house, with its black asphalt shingles, acted like a heat sink. It absorbed the Missouri sun and trapped it, turning the upstairs bedrooms into ovens where no one could sleep. His mother had eventually passed away that summer, her heart unable to take the strain of the relentless heat. Marcus had watched his father stare at the thermometer, a broken man who realized that the very structure he had built to protect his family had failed them. The house had become an enemy. After the funeral and the foreclosure, Marcus had made a silent vow. If he ever owned a piece of land again, he would build a home that didn't fight the environment. He would build a home that partnered with it. He spent years researching. He didn't just look at modern green roofs in New York or Chicago. He looked at the ancient traditions of Scandinavia and the turf huts of Iceland. He studied the values of various soil depths. He learned about the thermal mass of the earth and how it could delay heat transfer by a matter of hours, effectively shifting the heat of midday to the coolness of midnight. He learned about evapotranspiration, the way plants release moisture to cool the air around them, a natural air conditioning system that cost nothing but a bit of water. He spent his evenings at the kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly from a day of labor, drawing diagrams of root barriers and capillary mats. He calculated the weight of a square foot of saturated soil, roughly 30 pounds for every inch of depth. He realized that to hold 6 inches of earth and grass, his roof would need to support an additional 120,000 pounds of weight. It was a staggering figure. It meant he couldn't just throw dirt on the existing structure. He would have to rebuild the skeleton of the house itself. When he told the local lumber yard owner, Miller, what he was planning, the man just shook his head. "Marcus, you're talking about 6 by 12 rafters on 12-inch centers. You're building a bridge, not a roof. You're going to spend twice what the house is worth just to grow some weeds. Why don't you just buy a bigger AC unit and call it a day?" Marcus had looked Miller in the eye and said, "Because an AC unit breaks, the earth doesn't break. Because when the grid goes down or the fuel gets too expensive, the man with the grass on his roof is the only one who's going to be sleeping through the night." The preparation took 2 years. He didn't rush. He salvaged heavy oak timbers from an old barn that had been slated for demolition, hand-hewing them to ensure they could handle the immense load. He studied the native grasses of the Missouri prairie, looking for species that could handle both the drenching rains of spring and the brutal, baking droughts of summer. He chose big bluestem for its deep roots, little bluestem for its color, and buffalo grass for its resilience. He was creating an ecosystem, not a lawn. By the time he was ready to begin the actual construction, his savings were thin, and the whispers in town had turned into a steady roar of ridicule. But Marcus didn't care about the whispers. He cared about the data. He had installed sensors in the attic and the walls, tracking the temperature fluctuations of the old roof. He knew exactly what he was fighting. On a 100-degree day, his attic temperature hit 140. He was living under a lid of fire. The build began in the early spring, a race against the coming heat of July. Week 1 was the demolition of the old roof. He stripped away the layers of asphalt and rot, revealing the bones of the house. As he worked, exposed to the elements, a late spring storm rolled in. He spent 36 hours straight under a series of tarps, bailing water and praying the old walls wouldn't buckle. Bill, another neighbor who lived a mile down the road, stopped by while Marcus was hauling the old shingles to the dump. "You still going through with this, Marcus? You've got the house wide open. It's the perfect time to just put up some nice, reflective metal. It'd be cheaper, faster, and your wife wouldn't have to worrying about a goat jumping onto the roof to graze." Marcus chuckled. "I don't have a wife to worrying about, Bill, and the metal reflects the heat, sure, but it doesn't absorb it. It doesn't breathe. I'm looking for something that lives." The engineering was the hardest part. Once the heavy oak rafters were in place, Marcus had to create a waterproof seal that was absolute. In a traditional green roof, the biggest risk is a root piercing the membrane and letting water into the structure. He used a high-density polyethylene root barrier, followed by a thick EPDM rubber liner usually reserved for industrial ponds. He spent days on his hands and knees, heat welding the seams, testing every inch with a vacuum gauge. He knew that if he failed here, the neighbors would be right. He would be building a tomb. Over the waterproof layers came the drainage system. He didn't use standard gravel, which would have been too heavy. Instead, he sourced expanded clay pellets, lightweight, porous spheres that could hold moisture but allow excess water to flow freely toward the gutters. He covered this with a heavy-duty landscape fabric to keep the soil from clogging the drainage layer. By week 4, the frame was ready for the soil. This wasn't just dirt from the backyard. Marcus had spent months composting a specific mixture, 1 part local clay for mineral content, 1 part aged leaf mold for nutrients, and 2 parts perlite and vermiculite to keep the mixture light and airy. He needed a medium that would stay fertile but wouldn't compact into a hard, impenetrable brick under the sun. He rigged a pulley system using an old truck engine, hoisting 100-pound bags of the mixture up to the roof. The physical toll was immense. His back ached with a dull, constant throb, and his hands were so swollen he could barely make a fist at night. But as the dark earth began to fill the cedar grids on the roof, the house began to change. The first thing he noticed was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. A spring rainstorm hit during the 5th week of the build, just after he had finished laying the soil but before the grass had been planted. Usually, a rainstorm on a tin or shingle roof was a cacophony, a drumbeat that made conversation difficult. But as the rain hit the earth on the roof, there was only a soft, muffled thrum. The house felt solid, it felt grounded. It felt like it was part of the hill it sat upon, rather than a box perched on top of it. But the skepticism from the community didn't dampen with the rain. If anything, it grew. At the Saturday morning cattle auction, the talk wasn't just about the price of beef, it was about Marcus Henderson's roof. "I heard he's going to start a commercial mushroom farm up there," one farmer joked, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "I heard he's going to have to get a goat and a harness just to keep the grass trimmed," another added. Imagine that, a man mucking out a roof instead of a barn. Marcus kept his head down, sipping his coffee. He let them talk. He knew that in rural Missouri, a man's worth was measured by his results, not his theories. He had no results yet. All he had was a house that looked like a mud pit and a bank account that was nearly empty. Week 6 was the planting. He didn't use sod. Sod was lazy, and its roots were often shallow and pampered. Instead, he hand-seeded the entire 3,000 square feet of roof area. He moved in a slow, rhythmic pattern, casting the seeds of big bluestem, switchgrass, and purple prairie clover. He raked them in gently, then covered the entire surface with a thin layer of straw to protect the seeds from birds and the drying wind. Now came the waiting. For the next 3 weeks, he spent his mornings and evenings with a hose, keeping the roof misted. He became a slave to the weather reports. He needed the roots to take hold before the true heat arrived. He watched the first green shoots emerge through the straw, tiny, fragile spears of life that looked entirely too weak to survive a Missouri summer. "Is that it?" Silas asked, stopping by again. "That's your grand innovation, a few blades of crabgrass." "My backyard looks better than that, Marcus, and I didn't have to rebuild my rafters to get it." Marcus looked up at the greening roof. "It's not a lawn, Silas. It's a prairie. Just give it time." By the end of the 2nd month, the Henderson Folly was no longer a mud pit. It was a lush, vibrant carpet of green that stood out against the brown, sun-bleached hills like an emerald in the dust. The grasses had reached 6 inches in height, and the clover was beginning to bloom, attracting bees and butterflies that had previously ignored the house. But as the calendar turned to June, the weather began to shift. The pleasant spring rains vanished. The humidity began to climb, and the wind died down until the leaves on the oaks stood perfectly still. The local meteorologists began to use a term that sent a chill through every farmer in the county: heat dome. A massive high-pressure system was settling over the Midwest. It wasn't just going to be hot. It was going to be a record-breaking, multi-week event where the temperature wouldn't drop below 80 even at night. The ground began to crack, the creeks began to pull back, exposing mossy rocks to the searing air. This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for. He checked his sensors. The temperature outside was 95 degrees. In his attic, under 6 inches of moist earth and living grass, the temperature was a steady 72. He walked into his living room. He didn't turn on a fan. He didn't reach for an AC remote. He simply sat in the quiet, cool air listening to the sound of the bees humming on his roof. He could have been worried. He could have been doubting himself as the sky turned a hard, metallic blue, but he wasn't. He knew the test was coming, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt ready. The neighbors, however, were not. Across the valley, the sound of laboring air conditioners began to fill the air. Men were checking their wells and looking at their scorched crops with desperation in their eyes. The ridicule at the general store had stopped, replaced by a tense, sweaty silence. The heat was no longer a joke, it was a predator. And Marcus Henderson's house, with its strange, waving crown of green grass, stood in the center of the valley like a silent sentinel, waiting for the sun to do its worst. The transition from late June into July was not a gradual shift, it was a slamming of a door. The humidity, which usually hung like a damp rag, suddenly vanished, replaced by a wind that felt like it was blowing directly out of an open furnace. This was the true face of the Missouri drought. The red clay soil of the Ozarks began to pull apart, forming deep, jagged fissures that looked like lightning bolts frozen in the earth. In the town of Willow Creek, the talk at the diner shifted from the local baseball scores to the terrifying drop in the water table. Marcus watched his neighbors. He saw the way they moved hunched, hurried, scurrying from their air-conditioned trucks to their air-conditioned homes. They were fighting a war of attrition against the sun, and the sun was winning. Their electricity bills were soaring, some hitting $400 or $500 a month just to keep the interior of their homes at a tolerable 78 degrees. Their condensers groaned and rattled, struggling to shed heat into an environment that was already saturated with it. But on Marcus's ridge, the living roof was entering its most crucial phase. The grasses, the big bluestem and the Indian grass, had pushed their roots deep into the 6-inch layer of engineered soil. Those roots were now weaving together into a dense, biological mat, creating a structural integrity that Marcus had only seen in textbooks. He had designed a secondary irrigation system that most of the neighbors had mocked as another layer of over-engineering. He didn't rely on the city water or even a deep well pump that might fail during a blackout. Instead, he had built a gravity-fed gray water reclamation system. He could have let the laundry water and the shower water disappear into a septic tank like everyone else. He could have watched that nutrient-rich resource leach into the deep subsoil where it would do no one any good, but he didn't. He had installed a series of filtration barrels filled with sand and charcoal and a low-voltage solar pump that lifted the treated water to a holding tank on the highest point of his property. From there, a network of perforated hoses buried just 2 inches beneath the soil on the roof delivered a slow, steady drip of moisture directly to the roots. The science was elegant in its simplicity. As the sun hammered the roof, the plants would draw up this reclaimed water. Through the process of transpiration, they would release it into the air. This didn't just provide shade, it actively consumed heat. Each gallon of water that evaporated from the roof carried away roughly 8,000 BTUs of thermal energy. On a roof of 3,000 square feet, Marcus had essentially built a silent, 3-ton air conditioner that ran on nothing but sunshine and recycled bath water. On the 3rd of July, the local news anchor announced that the heat dome had reached its peak. The predicted high was 108 degrees, with a heat index of 120. The National Weather Service issued a code-red emergency. People were told to stay indoors, to check on the elderly, and to limit the use of heavy appliances to prevent a total collapse of the regional power grid. That afternoon, a black SUV pulled into Marcus's drive. It was the county building inspector, a man named Henderson, no relation, who had originally tried to deny Marcus's permit 2 years prior. He stepped out of the vehicle, his face turning an immediate shade of betrayed. He was mopping his neck with a soaked handkerchief. "Marcus," he said, his voice strained. "I was out this way checking on some reports of failing foundations down in the valley. I saw your place from the road. I wanted to see if you were still alive in there. It's 109 on my dashboard right now." Marcus was sitting on his porch, which was shaded by the overhang of the living roof. He wasn't sweating. He was wearing a light cotton shirt, and he looked as relaxed as a man on a crisp October morning. "Come on in, Greg." Grabbed some water. As Greg stepped through the front door, he stopped dead in his tracks. He looked around the room, his eyes searching for an air conditioning unit he knew wasn't there. He looked at the windows, which were closed. Then he looked at Marcus. "What the hell is going on in here?" Greg asked. It's cold. Did you hide a central air system in the cellar?" Marcus smiled and walked over to the digital thermometer mounted on the interior wall. He pointed to the display. Outside, 1 degree Fahrenheit. Inside, 74, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a 34-degree difference, Greg, or if you're looking at it in Celsius for the technical journals, nearly 15 degrees. And I haven't spent a penny on electricity today. Greg walked to the wall and touched it. The plaster was cool to the touch. He walked to the center of the room and looked up at the ceiling. In a normal house on a day like this, you could feel the heat radiating down from the attic. It was a physical pressure, like standing under a heat lamp. But here, there was only a profound, heavy silence. The house felt like a cave, but one filled with light. "How?" Greg whispered. "It's just grass, Marcus." "It's just dirt." Marcus shook his head. "It's never just dirt. It's thermal mass combined with phase change cooling. The sun is trying to push heat through 6 inches of moist earth. Earth is one of the best insulators we have, but it's also a heat sink. It takes a massive amount of energy to change the temperature of that much soil. By the time the midday heat manages to penetrate halfway through that roof, the sun is already setting. The heat never reaches the interior. It's buffered. The house isn't fighting the peak, it's ignoring it." Greg stayed for an hour simply because he couldn't bear to return to the furnace of his SUV. They sat in the quiet living room, and Marcus explained the measurements. He showed him the data logs. He showed him how the Henderson Folly was actually the most efficient structure in the 3-state area. When Greg finally left, his skepticism hadn't just been dampened, it had been extinguished. He drove away, looking back at the house, that strange, green oasis in a landscape of scorched brown, with a look of genuine awe, but the crisis was only beginning. The next day, the 4th of July, the power grid finally gave way. It started with a brownout at noon. Then, at 2 p.m., the hum of the valley died. The thousands of air conditioners that had been keeping the residents of Willow Creek on the edge of sanity suddenly fell silent. Within an hour, the interior temperatures of the standard homes in the valley began to climb. Without the mechanical fans pushing the heat out, the houses became traps. The asphalt shingles, heated to nearly 160 degrees by the direct sun, began to dump their stored energy into the rooms below. Marcus sat on his porch and watched the valley. Through a pair of binoculars, he could see his neighbors emerging from their front doors like ants from a flooded hill. They were carrying chairs, looking for any scrap of shade under the trees. But even the shade was useless when the air itself was 110 degrees. He could have stayed in his cool sanctuary. He could have locked the door and enjoyed the fruits of his labor in private, but he didn't. He knew that the philosophy of the homestead wasn't just about self-preservation. It was about community resilience. He knew that his innovation was only truly valuable if it could be shared. He walked down to the edge of his property where Silas Thorne was sitting in the bed of his truck, fanning himself with a piece of cardboard. Silas looked terrible. His skin was gray and his breathing was shallow. "Silas," Marcus called out. "Get your wife, get your dogs, come up to the house." Silas looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "I can't move, Marcus. The house is like an oven. I think the wallpaper is going to start peeling. We're just waiting for the power to come back on." "It's not coming back on for a while, Silas. The transformers down at the substation blew. Come up to my place. It's 74 degrees in my living room." Silas blinked, the words not quite registering. 74. You're lying. You don't even have a generator." "I don't need one," Marcus said. "I've got the grass." By 5 p.m., Marcus's living room was full. Silas and his wife were there. Bill and his grandchildren were there. Even Miller, the man from the lumber yard who had laughed at the heavy oak rafters, was sitting on Marcus's sofa, a glass of cold water in his hand. They sat in a daze, their bodies slowly shedding the trauma of the heat. They spoke in low voices, as if they were in a cathedral. The contrast was staggering. Outside, the world was dying. Birds were falling from the sky, and the very grass in the pastures was turning to ash. But inside Marcus's home, there was life. There was the smell of damp earth and the cool, filtered light coming through the windows. He could have lectured them. He could have reminded them of every joke, every sneer, and every time they had called him a fool, but he didn't. He simply moved among them, refilling water glasses and checking the temperature sensors. "Look at this," Miller said, gesturing toward the ceiling. "I've been building houses for 40 years. I've put in the best insulation money can buy. I've used radiant barriers and attic fans. But I've never seen anything like this. It's like the house is breathing. It is breathing," Marcus said. "That's the secret. We've spent 100 years trying to build boxes that seal the world out. We use chemicals and fans and electricity to force the environment to obey us, but the earth doesn't want to be obeyed. It wants to be partnered with that roof up there. It's taking the sun's energy and turning it into life. It's taking the heat and using it to grow. We aren't fighting the summer, we're using it." As the sun began to set a bloated, angry Red Bull on the horizon, the temperature outside remained in the high 90s. The houses in the valley remained uninhabitable. But on the ridge, 20 people were preparing to spend the night in comfort. They laid out sleeping bags on the cool hardwood floors. They shared a meal of cold sandwiches and fruit. That night, for the first time in years, the people of Willow Creek didn't talk about the price of beef or the failures of the government. They talked about the soil. They talked about the way their grandfathers used to build before the era of cheap energy made them lazy. They talked about the big bluestem and the way it held the moisture. They looked at Marcus Henderson not as a crank or a dreamer, but as a pioneer. He had shown them that innovation didn't always mean a faster processor or a more complex machine. Sometimes, innovation meant having the courage to look at a blade of grass and see a shield. The crisis of the heat dome lasted for another 6 days. During that time, Marcus's home became a hub for the community. People came to charge their phones from his small solar array, but they stayed for the coolness. They stayed to see the proof with their own eyes. They watched as Marcus climbed his ladder each evening to check the moisture levels in the soil. They saw the way the living roof didn't just survive the heat, but thrived in it. The purple prairie clover was in full bloom, a defiant splash of color in a world of brown, and the data held. Every day, as the mercury outside climbed past 100, the interior of the house stayed within a 3-degree window of 74. The 15 degrees Celsius difference became a local legend. It was the Henderson constant. It was the measurable, undeniable proof that the old ways, refined by modern engineering, were the key to a future that felt increasingly volatile. When the power finally flickered back to life on the 7th day, no one rushed to leave. They stood on the porch, looking out at the valley and then up at the green canopy above them. Silas turned to Marcus, his hand on the railing. "I reckon I owe you more than an apology, Marcus. I was looking at your roof and seeing a mess. I should have been looking at it and seeing a future. How much did you say those oak rafters cost?" Marcus smiled, looking out at the first hints of a cooling breeze. "It's not about the cost, Silas, it's about the investment. And I think it's time we started investing in something that grows." When the rains finally returned in late August, they didn't come as a gentle mercy. They came as a violent atmospheric correction. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the wind began to howl through the hollows, carrying the scent of ozone and wet dust. In the valley, the parched, cracked earth couldn't absorb the water fast enough. Flash floods turned the county roads into rivers, and the standard shingle roofs of Willow Creek were hammered by hail the size of marbles. Marcus stood by his window, watching the deluge. On a normal house, the sound would have been deafening, the frantic drumbeat of water on tin or the sharp cracks of hail hitting brittle asphalt. But under the living roof, the sound was a low, comforting murmur. The 6 inches of soil and the dense mat of prairie grass acted as a giant sponge. While the gutters on the neighbors' houses were overflowing and tearing away from the eaves, Marcus's drainage system was working with steady, rhythmic precision. The expanded clay pellets and the drainage fabric he had installed months ago were now proving their worth. The water filtered through the root systems, slowing down, losing its destructive velocity, and eventually trickling into the cisterns he had buried beneath the frost line. He wasn't just cooling his home anymore, he was harvesting the storm. By September, the landscape of the valley began to shift. The heat dome had been a wake-up call that no one could ignore. The local cooperative held a meeting at the Grange Hall, and for the first time in 30 years, the topic wasn't about new fertilizers or cattle breeds. It was about Marcus Henderson's roof. He arrived at the meeting expecting the same skepticism that had greeted him for years. Instead, he found a room full of men and women who looked at him with a quiet, desperate curiosity. They had seen the numbers. They had felt the coolness of his living room when the world outside was melting. They had seen his electricity meter stand perfectly still while theirs spun like a child's toy. Silas Thorne stood up first. He cleared his throat, his head held tight in his weathered hands. "Marcus," he said, his voice echoing in the hall, "we spent a lot of time laughing at you. We spent a lot of time calling you a fool for trying to grow a field on your rafters. But my wife and I, we sat in your house for 3 days when the grid went down. We felt that 30-degree difference. We saw that while our garden died in the dirt, yours was blooming on the roof. I want to know ... I want to know if you'll show me how to do it. My roof is due for a replacement next spring, and I don't want to put another layer of fire on my house." The room went silent, waiting for Marcus's response. He could have been smug. He could have reminded them of the jokes about the goats and the mudslides. He could have walked out and left them to figure it out on their own, but he didn't. He stood up, walked to the chalkboard at the front of the room, and picked up a piece of white chalk. He didn't start with a lecture on climate change or environmentalism. He started with the math. He drew a cross-section of a standard roof and a cross-section of a living roof. He wrote down the R values. He wrote down the thermal mass calculations. "It's not magic, Silas," Marcus said, "it's physics. A standard roof is designed to shed water and reflect a bit of light. But a living roof is an engine, it's a biological system that manages energy. If you're willing to build the structure to hold the weight, the earth will do the rest of the work for you." For the next 3 hours, Marcus held court. He explained the importance of the root barrier. He detailed the specific ratio of perlite to compost. He spoke about the big bluestem and why its deep, fibrous roots were the key to holding the soil together during a Missouri downpour. He didn't hide anything. He gave away the blueprints he had spent years perfecting. He shared the names of the suppliers who sold the EPDM liners and the expanded clay. He could have sold those blueprints. He could have started a consulting firm and charged $1,000 a visit. He could have patented the specific drainage assembly he had invented, but he didn't. He knew that an innovation is only as strong as the community that adopts it. He knew that one greenhouse on a ridge was a curiosity, but 100 greenhouses in a valley was a revolution. As the first frost of October touched the hills, the conversation shifted again. The skeptics who had conceded that the roof worked in the heat now began to whisper about the cold. "Sure, it stays cool in the summer," Miller said at the lumber yard. "But come January, when the wind is whipping down from Canada at 20 below, that wet dirt on his roof is going to turn into a 3,000 square foot ice cube. He's going to be living in a refrigerator. He'll be burning 10 cords of wood just to keep his pipes from freezing." Marcus heard the whispers, but he wasn't worried. He knew what the others didn't. Thermal mass works both ways. The same 6 inches of earth that delayed the sun's heat from entering the house in July would delay the interior heat from escaping in January. He knew that the earth itself stays at a relatively constant 55 degrees once you get a few feet down. While his roof wasn't a few feet deep, it was a living ecosystem that generated its own microclimate. The first true test of winter arrived in mid-December. A blue norther swept across the plains, dropping the temperature from 45 degrees to -5 in the span of 6 hours. The wind was relentless, a biting, invisible blade that searched for every crack and crevice in the old farmhouses of the valley. In a standard house, the heat loss through the roof is responsible for nearly 40% of the energy bill. The warm air rises, hits the cold ceiling, and the energy is sucked out into the atmosphere. People in Willow Creek were layering on blankets and cranking up their wood stoves, watching the smoke disappear into the frigid night. But inside the Henderson house, the atmosphere was different. Marcus had stopped watering the roof in November, allowing the grasses to go dormant. The long, golden stalks of the big bluestem had folded over, creating a thick, natural layer of thatch on top of the soil. This wasn't just dead grass, it was an additional layer of trapped air, one of the best insulators found in nature. He checked his sensors at midnight. Outside, -8 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He had a small fire going in the wood stove, but it was idling, barely consuming to logs every 4 hours. The soil on his roof hadn't turned into an ice cube. Instead, it had frozen only in the top. Below that, the moisture and the biological activity of the dormant roots, combined with the heat rising from the house, kept the soil in a state of suspended animation. The house wasn't fighting the cold, it was wearing a thick, earthen coat. On Christmas Eve, Silas Thorne walked up the ridge to Marcus's house. He was bundled in a heavy parka, his breath blooming in the air like white smoke. He knocked on the door, and when Marcus opened it, Silas was hit with a wave of warmth that didn't feel like the dry, parching heat of a furnace. It felt like the warmth of a greenhouse, moist, solid, and deep. "I just had to see for myself," Silas said, stepping inside and pulling off his gloves. "My house is drafty as a barn tonight. I've got the thermostat set to 75 and I'm still shivering. And here you are, sitting in a t-shirt." "It's the thatch," Silas, Marcus said, handing him a mug of coffee. "The grass died back and made a blanket. I've got an effective R value of nearly R60 up there right now. Most of these houses in the valley are lucky to have R19 in the attic. I'm not losing my heat to the sky. I'm keeping it right here in the room." Silas sat by the stove, watching the quiet flames. "Marcus," he said after a long silence, "you're changing the way I look at this land. I always thought of the farm as something I had to beat into submission. I had to kill the weeds, I had to plow the dirt, I had to shield the house from the weather. But you're letting the land take care of you." "That's the philosophy, Silas," Marcus replied. "We spend our lives trying to be separate from the world. We build boxes that cut us off from the seasons. But when you put the earth back on top of your head, you remember that you're part of it. You stop fighting the rhythm of the year and you start dancing with it." By the following spring, the Henderson Folly was a folly no more. It was a prototype. 6 of the neighbors, including Silas and Miller, had formed a cooperative to purchase the specialized membranes and drainage materials in bulk. They spent their weekends on each other's roofs, hauling soil and planting seeds. Marcus acted as the foreman, moving from house to house with his level and his sensor kits. He showed them how to reinforce their joists with salvaged timber. He taught them the art of the waterproof seam. The community of Willow Creek was becoming the first living ridge in the state. But the impact went beyond just energy bills. As the living roofs multiplied, the ecology of the valley began to change. The runoff into the local creeks slowed down, and the water became clearer, filtered by hundreds of thousands of square feet of prairie grass. The local bee population exploded. Rare butterflies that hadn't been seen in the county for decades began to reappear, drawn by the islands of native flora perched 30 feet above the ground. The 15 degrees Celsius difference was no longer a statistic in Marcus's notebook, it was a regional phenomenon. In the summer of the following year, when another heat wave rolled through, the local power company reported a 12% drop in peak demand for the Willow Creek area. It was the first time in the company's history that a growing community had actually used less power than the year before. Marcus Henderson sat on his porch, now 60 years old, his hair as white as the clover that bloomed above his head. He watched the valley below him. He saw the green roofs of his neighbors, waving in the breeze like the surface of a high-altitude sea. He saw the smoke from their chimneys in the winter, thinner and less desperate than it used to be. He had achieved what he set out to do. He had built a home that didn't just shelter him, but sustained him. He had turned a personal tragedy, the loss of his mother, to the heat and his father's farm to the drought, into a legacy of resilience for an entire community. He could have been satisfied with his own comfort. He could have ignored the struggles of the people who had mocked him. He could have let the knowledge die with him, but he didn't. He knew that the true innovation wasn't the rubber liner or the clay pellets. The true innovation was the shift in perspective. It was the realization that human ingenuity is at its best when it mimics the wisdom of the natural world. It was the understanding that a house is not a machine for living, but a part of the living world itself. The legacy of Marcus Henderson didn't end with the roofs. It sparked a movement in the rural Midwest. Architectural students began to travel to Willow Creek to study the Henderson method. They brought their computers and their infrared cameras, and they confirmed what Marcus had known all along: the Earth is the best architect we have. But Marcus didn't care much for the students or their cameras. He cared about the sound of the rain on his roof. He cared about the way the house stayed cool while the sun tried to bake the hills. He cared about the fact that Silas Thorne's grandchildren could sleep through the night in July without a fan. He had proven that even in a world of high-tech solutions and complex machinery, the most profound answers are often found right beneath our feet. Or, in his case, right over our heads. The story of the living roof became a parable in the Ozarks. It was told to children as a lesson in perseverance. It was told to farmers as a lesson in adaptation. It was the story of a man who looked at a blade of grass and saw a way to save a world. And as Marcus Henderson closed his eyes each night, he didn't hear the hum of a machine. He didn't hear the rattle of a failing AC unit. He heard the rustle of the big bluestem in the wind. He heard the heartbeat of the earth, steady and cool, protecting him from the fire of the sun and the bite of the frost. He was home, and for the first time in his life, he knew that the home would last. While the thermal benefits of the living roof were the most immediate and visible success, the true genius of Marcus Henderson's design lay in what the neighbors couldn't see. Beneath the waving stalks of big bluestem and the vibrant purple prairie clover sat a complex, multi-layered filtration and structural system that functioned like the internal organs of a living creature. Marcus knew that to reach the 15 degrees Celsius temperature differential, the roof couldn't just be a passive layer of dirt. It had to be an active hydrological system. He spent his evenings during the first autumn documenting the thermal leg of his home. He used a series of 16 infrared sensors placed at varying depths within the roof assembly. He discovered that while the surface of the grass might fluctuate by 40 degrees in a single day, the temperature at the base of the soil layer, the point where the earth met the EPDM membrane, only moved by a staggering 1.5 degrees over a 24-hour period. This was the thermal battery effect. He could have been content with the basic insulation. He could have ignored the micro fluctuations of the soil moisture, but he didn't. He realized that the moisture content of the soil was the coolant of the house. If the soil became too dry, it lost its thermal mass and its ability to evaporate water. If it became too wet, the weight could exceed the structural limits of the oak rafters. The structural engineering was a marvel of rural ingenuity. To support the saturated weight of the roof, which Marcus calculated at 135 pounds per square foot during a heavy Missouri rain, he had reinforced the foundation of the house using a technique he called the stone footing. Instead of standard poured concrete, which can crack under lateral pressure, he had harvested river stones and set them in a lime-based mortar. This created a foundation that was slightly flexible, allowing the house to settle under the shifting weight of the living roof without compromising the integrity of the walls. He had built the walls using double stud construction, creating a 12-inch cavity that he filled not with fiberglass, but with a mixture of chopped straw and clay slip. This light straw clay provided a perfect complement to the living roof. The walls breathed at the same rate as the ceiling. When the humidity rose, the walls absorbed excess moisture. When the air turned dry, they released it. But the true test of the system's secondary function arrived in the second year of the project. A regional drought, even more severe than the first, led to the great water rationing of the Ozarks. The local municipality, seeing the water table drop to historic lows, banned all outdoor watering. Farmers were forced to choose between their livestock and their gardens. Most watched as their vegetable patches turned to dust and their decorative lawns became fire hazards. Marcus, however, had his gray water loop. He could have relied on the city line. He could have tapped into the dwindling aquifer like everyone else, but he didn't. He had designed his home so that every drop of water was used 3 times. The water from his kitchen sink and shower, roughly 40 gallons a day, didn't go into a septic tank. It went into a 3-stage aerobic digester he had built behind the barn. Stage 1 was a settlement tank where solids were broken down by anaerobic bacteria. Stage 2 was a living machine, a series of tanks filled with gravel, irises, and cattails. The plants acted as biological filters, their roots absorbing nitrogen and phosphorus, while the bacteria on the gravel surfaces neutralized pathogens. Stage 3 was an ultraviolet sterilization chamber powered by a single 10-watt solar panel. The resulting water wasn't potable for humans, but it was gold for the roof. While his neighbors were being fined for using a garden hose, Marcus's roof was being fed a constant, automated diet of nutrient-rich recycled water. Silas Thorne came by one afternoon during the height of the rationing. He looked at the lush, green canopy of Marcus's roof, then at his own brown, dying yard. "Marcus," he said, leaning against his truck, "the sheriff is out handing out tickets for watering. How is it that your place looks like the Garden of Eden and you haven't turned on your well pump in 3 weeks?" Marcus took Silas around the back of the house. He showed him the digester. He showed him the irises blooming in the gray water tanks. "I'm not using a drop of new water, Silas. I'm just using the same 40 gallons over and over. I wash my face, the irises clean the water, the solar pump lifts it to the roof, and the big bluestem turns it into coolness. The house is a closed loop." Silas stared at the cattails, a look of realization crossing his face. "We've been treating water like a waste product, haven't we? We use it once and then we try to hide it in the ground." "You're treating it like blood." "Exactly," Marcus said. "A house shouldn't be a drain on the environment. It should be a participant. Every gallon I recycle is a gallon that stays in the aquifer for your cattle." As the news of Marcus's water-neutral homestead spread, the local university sent a team of environmental engineers to document the site. They arrived with flow meters and water quality testing kits. They expected to find high levels of bacteria or structural strain. Instead, they found a system that was outperforming modern municipal standards. They discovered that the living roof was also acting as a massive carbon sink. In 1 year, the 3,000 square feet of prairie grass on Marcus's roof was sequestering the equivalent carbon of a half-acre of mature forest. Because the soil was never tilled and the roots were allowed to grow deep and undisturbed, the carbon was being locked into the earth in a stable, long-term form. Marcus didn't care much for the carbon calculations, but he did care about the species count. He began keeping a journal on his nightstand. In the 3 years since he had installed the roof, he had documented 40 species of birds visiting his house. He had seen hawks perched on the ridgepole, hunting the field mice that occasionally tried to make a home in the thatch. He had seen rare pollinators, like the rusty-patched bumblebee, thrive in the purple prairie clover. His home had become a biological bridge. In a landscape fragmented by roads, fences, and chemically treated lawns, Marcus's roof provided a high-altitude sanctuary for the native life of the Ozarks. He could have seen the mice and the bees as pests. He could have used pesticides and traps to keep his roof clean and manicured. But he didn't. He understood that a living roof is only healthy if it is part of a food chain. He welcomed the hawks because they controlled the mice. He welcomed the bees because they pollinated the clover. He was no longer just a homeowner, he was a park ranger for a quarter-acre of the sky. The philosophy of the living ridge began to permeate the local culture. It wasn't just about the temperature or the water anymore. It was about a different way of existing in the world. During the winter of the third year, Marcus organized the first sod-turning festival. Instead of a traditional barn raising, he invited the community to help seed the roof of the new local library. He had convinced the town council that a living roof would save the taxpayers thousands in utility costs. As 20 men and women stood on the roof of the library, casting seeds of little bluestem and side oats grama into the wind, Marcus felt a sense of completion. He looked at their hands, rough, calloused, the hands of people who had spent their lives fighting the earth. Now, those same hands were gently raking the soil, preparing a bed for the very plants they used to consider weeds. He could have focused on his own retirement. He could have sat on his porch and watched the world go by, but he didn't. He spent his days teaching living architecture to the local high school students. He showed them how to calculate the evapotranspirative potential of different plant species. He taught them how to weld EPDM seams and how to balance the pH of a gray water tank. He was planting seeds of a different kind, seeds of knowledge that would ensure the 15 degrees Celsius difference wouldn't just be a fluke of one man's obsession, but a standard for the future of the region. One student, a young woman named Clara, whose family had lost their farm during the same drought that claimed Marcus's father's land, asked him a question that stayed with him. "Mr. Henderson, why did you wait so long to do this? If this works so well, why isn't every house in America built this way?" Marcus looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set behind the green-crowned hills. "Because, Clara, it's easier to buy a machine than it is to build an ecosystem. We live in a world that values the quick fix over the long-term rhythm. To build a house like this, you have to be patient, you have to be willing to be laughed at. You have to be willing to work with the earth instead of just taking from it. Most people aren't ready for that kind of commitment, but looking at you, I think that's starting to change. The legacy was no longer just about the house on the ridge. It was about the realization that a human habitat could be a net positive for the planet. Marcus Henderson had proven that we don't have to choose between comfort and ecology. We can have both, but only if we have the courage to put our roots down literally and figuratively. As the seasons continued their cycle, the Henderson constant remained. Through blizzards that buried the valley in 3 feet of snow and heat waves that turned the sky to brass, the house remained a steady, quiet 74 degrees. It was a monument to the power of thermal mass, the efficiency of biological cooling, and the indomitable spirit of a man who refused to accept that the modern way was the only way. The 15 degrees Celsius difference was more than a measurement. It was a promise that even in a warming world we can find shade, a promise that even in a drought we can find water, and a promise that if we take care of the earth, even on top of our very roofs, the earth will take care of us.